Have you ever wondered what a house would say if it could talk? For a house with a history that spans over 520 years, I'm sure could tell a story or two. Bishops House is the best preserved example of a timber-framed house to survive in Sheffield. At the time of its construction, around 1525, England unbeknowingly was at the beginning of a turbulent era. King Henry VIII had been sitting on the English throne for around 16 years. A powerful monarch who was beginning an infatuation with his wife's lady-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. A love affair that history tells us would turn the Tudor court and the whole of England and Anne herself on its head. From this moment on, Bishops House sees its fair share of turbulent history. From the gunpowder plot, the execution of King Charles I, the English Civil War and a further 2 world wars. More localised, it is also in this very area that the occupants here would have seen the start of the Sheffield Industrial Revolution, an occasion that puts it on the map and makes it known famously today as the Steel City. So let's take a step inside and see whether these walls can talk. Hello everyone and welcome to the channel The Wanderless Way. Today's video we're going to cover the incredibly well preserved Bishops House in Sheffield. Sat unassumingly in a public park and just across the road from normal English suburbia it sleeps. Now a free museum run entirely by volunteers, we're going to take a walk through the building that shares a history spanning over 52 decades. We'll listen for the whispers of the people who once called this place home and bring them back to life even just for a moment. With life and death shrouded in superstition during the Tudor and Stuart times, we'll learn how the inhabitants here would put their faith in charms and white magic to ward off any evil spirits. The house has without doubt its fair share of tales and legends, but please stay to the end of the video where we'll uncover a fascinating mystery that made the newspaper headlines in 2021. So please sit back, relax and enjoy the video. If you do enjoy it, we'd really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up at the end so we know it's been interesting. We'd also love you to come along for future videos, so please hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and then you'll see similar content again next week. Thank you. The Grade 2 listed Bishops House Museum is a rare surviving example of Sheffield's pre-industrial past, located in the public Mearsbrook Park. The house is important because in many ways it typifies the development of the smaller English domestic house in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Hall at Norton Lees, as this building was once known, is one of the best preserved and earliest examples of a timber-framed house to have survived in this area. Once a rural Derbyshire hamlet, Norton is now part of Sheffield. At one time, timber buildings would have been relatively common, but many of these have now diminished, and there must be something special about Bishops House for it to still stand today. When the house was built, it sat among scattered farms and hamlets in the valleys of the fast-flowing streams. Sheffield was a small market town on the banks of the River Don and the River Sheaf. The people who lived in this house had a magnificent view, with rolling hills and farmland in every direction. Muddy tracks and narrow roads crisscrossed the valley and led over the hills to the markets below. The bustling marketplace was the heart of Tudor and Stuart life in the town. Pack-horse traders travelled from miles around to sell their goods. Early on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, they gathered around the market cross to sell a huge variety of meat, fish and vegetables. Farming was still the main industry, but the area was achieving new prosperity through a monopoly over local scythe making. At the time, Norton was the principal community in the north of England for the making of sickles and scythes, and it is at this moment that we'll introduce our first character to the story, the region's most successful scythe maker and occupant of Bishops House, William Blythe. Although it isn't known who exactly Bishops House was built for, we do know that it was likely a middle-class dwelling and probably the right size for a wealthy gentleman or farmer who owned his own land. Up steps William. He is said to be one of the earliest occupants here. If you look closely, you can see his initials appear carved in the panelling in the hall. Although farming was the main occupation in this area, It was not uncommon for William to want to expand his portfolio in order to generate extra revenue. History tells us that some of the farming entrepreneurs were also involved in milling corn, woodland management, and various other small industries. For William Blythe, this meant renting equipment and premises to smiths and grinders who produced the scythes. This profitable sideline meant that he died a wealthy farmer, leaving his heirs a fortune of £641. When he died, his stock of 1,900 scythes, iron and steel was worth £231, almost as much as the farm. He was probably the main producer of scythes in the area at the time. He is an outstanding example of the men who combined farming and industry, leading the Sheffield's later industrial success. If you are interested in this part of the history, then do subscribe for next week's video, where we will visit the Abbeydale industrial hamlet just a few miles away. After the death of William Sr., we'll welcome along another William. William Blythe II, we believe, lived in the house from around 1642. Son of the former, and perhaps wanting to put his own stamp on the home after his father died, William set to work, and it is thought that another lot of alterations were completed by him. He built a stone two-storey extension to the back of the west wing, including a spiral staircase. This William Blythe was a captain in the Parliamentary army during the English Civil War. He was one of the 2 officers who were in charge of the demolition of Sheffield Castle. Sheffield Castle, built in the late 11th century or early 12th century, was one of the most important castles in the north of England. At the time of the English Civil War, it was held by the Royalists for the king with around 300 soldiers. A 10-day siege ensued by Cromwell's Roundheads, which resulted in the Royalist surrender. Around 2 years after this event, the House of Commons passed a resolution that it should be made untenable, and in 1647-48 it was demolished. It is recorded that a Captain Blythe paid £3 for boards and plaster from this castle. Historians believe that these may have been used to make some of the improvements to Bishops House, and we'll see an example of that in more detail shortly. William Blythe died in 1665, having received a free pardon from Charles II for his part in the English Civil War against the Royalists. Like his father, he combined farming and industry, and his scythes were sold all over the north of England. His gravestone can be seen in the porch of Norton Parish Church. The house remained in the family for a further 92 years. The last Blythe to live in the house was Samuel, minister at Attercliffe. On his death in 1753, the property was sold. It was around this point that the house was divided into 2 separate homes. From then on, the house sees a number of new guests, including the Roebuck family, the Shaws, George and Thomas Wilde, and Joseph and James White. Little is known to me about their stories, other than they were most probably farming families. What evidence the house shows us is that during this time a new staircase, dairy, new windows, partition and fireplaces were added. Around this time some renovation work was done on the house, and the surrounding barns and outbuildings were demolished. In 1886, Meersbrook Park was formed. Public concern was growing that the estate would be built upon, and so following a meeting in 1885, the Sheffield Corporation bought 15 hectares from the Lands Allotment Company, and Meersbrook Park was opened in September 1887. The house was let to employees of the Recreation Department and their families, in which time a succession of gardeners and park keepers lived here. Incredibly, the house remained occupied until as recently as 1973, at which time the Gill family called it home. Peter Gill and his wife Elizabeth moved in from 1959 to 1973 after Peter obtained a position as park attendant in Meersbrook Park. Settling in well, they went on to extend their family, and their children were all born in Bishops House between those dates. The house at this time was still split into 2 halves, with Mr. and Mrs. Whatton living on the left side and the Gills living on the right. The daughter now shares her childhood memories in a book which can be found inside the house. In her own words, we can get a glimpse of what living here was really like. The park gates used to open early in the morning and close at 9 p.m. at night, which meant we were locked in, also, and had the run of the park. My dad worked as a park attendant, which involved looking after the grounds. His wage were £4.25 a week, and the rent was 7 and 6 shillings a week. By the front door on the wall there was a perch where a barn owl used to sit. My dad had rescued it from a tree he tended to. On the left-hand side of Bishops House, where Mr. and Mrs. Whattam lived, there was a cellar which used to be used during battles to hide women and children. There was a font in the cellar to christen newborn babies during these battles. The Gills moved on in 1973, and Bishops House opened as a museum in July 1976. If you're wondering what's in the name Bishops House, I'm afraid we don't have many answers. The name is misleading and another mystery in itself. It comes from a local tradition that 2 future bishops lived here during their childhoods. The 2 bishops in question became John Bishop of Salisbury and Geoffrey Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield, and both were brothers, rumoured to be connected by a distant cousin link. However, this simply cannot be true, as tree ring dating has showed they lived long before the building we see today ever existed. So where does our story actually begin? The science tells us that this house was built around 1500 and that it has a big wooden framework. The gaps in the frame were filled in using sticks of oak known as lath. This was covered with a layer of plaster to keep out the wind and rain. As we look at the house, the white stripes are plaster and the black stripes are wood. In the Tudor times, only the wealthiest could afford a house built of stone and brick. Most houses like this one were built with oak, which was plentiful, strong and long-lasting. Timber frames were made by hand from freshly cut oak trees, as the wood was easier to cut when it was still green. As the wood dried out, the frames became crooked and twisted. If you've ever wondered why a Tudor house often looks wonky, well, now you know. The Nottingham Tree Ring Dating Laboratory was able to use 14 samples from around the house to date the building. At Bishops House, the main structural timbers were shaped on site. The joints were numbered to make it easier to fit them together, and the pieces were fastened together with wooden pegs. The entire framework would have been assembled in just one day. Imagine what excitement the house owner would have felt, seeing an empty space in the morning be filled by a complete structure come nightfall. Have you ever seen a house built in such a short space of time? Let me know in the comments whether you were as impressed as I am. The plaster walls, roof, floors and window shutters were added over the next few weeks. The windows were originally unglazed, with wood shutters or fabric to keep the weather out. Window glass wasn't very often in ordinary houses until the late 1500s. All furniture is based upon inventories and is not original to the house, only the panelling survived the years. So let's take a walk through and let our eyes explore. The parlour. The parlour was a private space. It was used as a bedroom in the 16th century and a dining room in the 17th. It is in the parlour where the best silver would be stored, and the women would make it as a working room. In the early 17th century, several Sheffield houses were given a makeover in the latest style. The parlour was often luxuriously redecorated with oak panelling, plaster ceilings and carved over mantels. The hall. The hall would have been the main living space where people ate, conducted business and entertained their guests. It was here that you can imagine the centre of family life existed, a place for family, friends and workers to gather and share local news and gossip around a roaring open fire. Extra light would be generated by flickering tallow candles made from animal fat. The fireplace would have been central, and a canopy above would have helped to guide all the smoke out through the roof. The floor would have been made of earth, and warm bull's blood was rubbed in to seal the dust into it. Straw and rushes were then scattered on top. The stone floor was probably put in during the 1800s. The new chamber. This part of Bishop's House was built around 1650. Plasterwork over the fireplace shows the common emblem of the Talbot family who had been resident at Sheffield Castle. Remembering the record of William's purchase of boards and plaster from the castle, it is likely that this is the one and the same, and the only example remaining of the castle interior. It may be in the corner of a darkened bedroom in the dead of the night, where a person's darkest fears can reside, and from the evidence the house shows us, these anxieties were most certainly real for some of the residents here. Scratched or burned into the timber beams of this old house, you will find another side of history, where the fear of the unknown meant people sought out ways to protect against witches and demons. Belief in witchcraft, the devil, good and bad luck, and the healing power of ordinary things were once common practice. Apotropaic marks, also known as witches' marks, are patterns scratched or drawn on the fabric of old buildings, which were placed there superstitiously to ward off evil spirits. Bishops House has no shortage of these marks, and as well as the scratched patterns, there are burn marks. Burn marks were made deliberately as form of sympathetic magic, using fire to bless the building against fire, or to protect it from the fires of hell. In the home, carved faces above doorways and fireplaces were thought to stop evil spirits from entering the house. There are several of these here. Inside the hall you can read George Wilde's story by Kenneth Dash. It gives a little insight into these superstitions. That evening we sat downstairs. Sarah was mending her apron. I sat with ease, chewing a mutton bone. The new door was banging as the breeze got up. A log settled in the hearth and brought fresh flames. I took a candle over to the door and took out my knife. I braced the door open with my knee and cut my initials, GW, and blew away the wood shavings. As I moved the candle away, it lit the upper part of the door. There were a few circles carved there, circles with 6 petals within. I'd seen these on the pews at St James's Church up at Norton when Anne had been baptised. An old widow had seen me looking. "They bless the child before it is received by the Lord," she had said. "You may find them in houses too. They will stop the evil spirits." Sarah stood up, bringing my thoughts back to the present. "Let us to bed, George. I have to be up early, snow or not. Your father is going to fetch the Christmas goose in the morning. It will need to be plucked." I nodded and looked again at the door. Who knew what spirits may ride with the storm? Superstitions and traditions live on today in many common gestures and actions. People use the things around them, such as black cats, ladders and horseshoes, as symbols of good or bad luck. People were just the same 500 years ago. If you'd like to hear more about this side of the history, please let me know in the comments and I'll make a separate video on that. Do you believe in superstitions? Let me know. Do you salute a magpie or cross the street rather than walk under a pair of ladders? Let me know in the comments or contact me on social media. Ghosts. As with all old buildings, there are reports of ghostly activity here. The South Yorkshire Spooky Stories website tells of a ghostly grey lady who would be seen looking out from the windows at visitors approaching the house, or that the rocking chair in the house would mysteriously start rocking for no apparent reason. The daughter of the Gill family, who were the most recent inhabitants, shares her views on this. "I was born in the main bedroom at Bishops House on the 22nd of August 1963. My friends used to call me the girl who lived at Bishop's House and always wanted to know if it was haunted. I don't remember any experiences, although the floorboards creaked and there were a few unexplained noises. My mum has said that she did see a dark figure in the lounge door at the front of the house we didn't use. This happened on more than one occasion." Before we end our video with more details on how you can visit, let's look at one of the most recent mysteries, a story that has kept the volunteers here wondering for years. In 2021, Bishop's House hit the newspaper headlines when an astonishing discovery reunited a long-lost and precious carved oak fireplace back to Bishop's House more than a century after it was removed. In 1655, Captain William Blythe III's daughter Constance married George Shillitoe. To coincide with the event, William upgraded the parlour with ornate oak panelling and a fine carved oak chimneypiece. The carvings were done by highly skilled joiners from Norton. At some point before the house was sold to the Sheffield Corporation, that chimneypiece and oak panelling were all removed and believed to be lost. Lecturer and consultant in cultural history David Boswick learnt of the chimneypiece in 1988 when he discovered an advert for an auction that had taken place in 1922. After it had been removed from the 16th century Bishop's House, it found its way into the collection of a Dr. Morton. When the doctor died, the chimneypiece was once again auctioned off and afterwards considered lost without a trace. During the year 2018, however, David Boswick, still determined to stay on the trail, put out a plea, and it was believed that the chimney-piece was most likely in the hands of an American collector. With an outcome like this, it was unlikely to ever be returned. But all was not lost, because during the lockdown of the COVID-19 pandemic, David's fellow researcher Andrew Bower discovered the location of the fireplace when a property in the south of England was listed for sale on the internet. It was an astonishing discovery, and Andrew was quick to let the rest of the team know that the mystery had at last been solved. The newspapers reported that Chairman of Bishops House, Nick Roscoe, was equally astonished to discover that the owner of the chimney-piece, who wishes to remain anonymous, was willing to consider selling it. Speaking to the press, Nick quoted, "We were incredibly lucky and the owner was very kind, letting us buy it for half its estimated value. We had been saving for another project and it has sunk our bank balance, but it was so important to seize the opportunity whilst we could." And so, the puzzle is solved. The chimney-piece is now back where it belongs in the parlour of Bishops House. Friends of Bishops House is a registered charity run entirely by volunteers. If you'd like to make a donation to support their cause, please visit their website and I'll pop a link in the description below. Thanks to everyone for watching the video and for the wonderful volunteers that keep this place alive. Most of the information in this video has been taken from the many resources inside the building and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you. If you've enjoyed the video, please do hit the like button so we know it's been good, and do subscribe to see next week's video where we take a walk around Abbeydale Industrial Hamlet. Thanks everyone, hope you get the chance to visit Bishop's House for yourself real soon.